The police report said it was a wellness check. Just a routine call. A neighbor concerned. Nothing unusual for a quiet retirement community in Central Florida on a warm Tuesday morning. The kind of call that gets logged, handled, and forgotten by noon. But the deputy who pulled into that driveway on Magnolia Crest Lane in the Villages knew something was different before he even knocked on the door. The garage was open. The garden had been freshly watered. A pair of gardening gloves sat folded neatly on the porch railing. Everything looked normal. Everything looked too normal. Like a stage set. Like someone had arranged it that way, on purpose. He knocked twice. The door opened immediately. Like she had been standing behind it, waiting. Carol Ann was 54 years old. Medium height. Soft brown hair pulled back. Reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She was wearing a pale blue cardigan and holding a cup of coffee with both hands. She smiled at the deputy, the way a librarian smiles at a student who has finally returned an overdue book. Patient. Knowing. A little tired. She stepped aside and let him in without being asked. The house was immaculate. Not just clean. Organized. Every surface clear. Every cushion in place. The kind of house that told you something about the person who lived in it. Someone who paid attention. Someone who noticed things. The deputy looked around the kitchen. Empty. He looked toward the hallway. Nothing. He looked back at Carol Ann. She was sitting at the kitchen table now. Hands folded in her lap. Coffee cup set aside. Eyes dry. Completely calm in a way that didn't sit right with him. Not the calm of someone who had nothing to worry about. The calm of someone who had already done everything they needed to do. He asked her where her husband was. She said she didn't know exactly. Then she said she had a feeling he wouldn't be coming back on his own. He asked her if she was all right. She said she was fine. Better than she had been in a long time, actually. Then she slid a small green notebook across the kitchen table toward him. She said he might want to call someone from the Financial Crimes Unit. She said there was a lot in there. She said she had organized it by date and cross-referenced the names in the back. The deputy looked at the notebook. Then back at her. Then he picked up his radio. 14 minutes later. There were 3 vehicles in the driveway on Magnolia Crest Lane. And the woman who had called 911 the night before. That was Diane. Carol Ann's best friend. The same woman whose name appeared 4 times in Richard's secret phone. The same woman who had welcomed Carol into the neighborhood with a fruit basket 3 years ago. The same woman who had coffee with her every Tuesday morning. And walked with her every Wednesday evening. And organized the block barbecue every 4th of July. That woman had made the call. And Carol Ann had been ready for it. The detective who arrived that morning was a man named Ray Morrow. He had worked Sumner County for 11 years. He had seen domestic situations, and financial crimes, and property disputes. And every variety of quiet suburban ugliness that retirement communities produce when people have too much time. And too much money. And too little honesty. He was not prepared for Carol Ann Whitfield. He sat down across from her at that kitchen table. She opened the notebook to page 1. And she began. That smile she gave him when he first walked in. Patient. Knowing. Tired. It stayed with Detective Morrow for a long time afterward. Not because it was threatening or cold. Because it was the smile of a woman who had already won. Before anyone else in the room even knew there was a game being played. They called it Paradise for retirees. The Villages. A master-planned retirement community stretched across 3 counties in Central Florida. Sumter. Marion. Lake. 55,000 acres of carefully constructed comfort. Manicured streets. Pristine golf courses. swimming pools and tennis courts, and pickleball courts, and shuffleboard courts. Town squares, with live music every single night of the year. Restaurants, and boutiques, and movie theaters, and doctors' offices, and pharmacies. All within golf cart distance. No stoplights on the main paths. Just golf carts, gliding smoothly past identical houses. With identical mailboxes. And identical flower beds. Maintained to identical standards. By the community's own landscaping service. The Villages was built for people who had worked their entire lives. And finally, wanted rest. People who had raised children. And buried parents. And sat through decades of alarm clocks, and Monday morning meetings, and quarterly reports. People who had earned the right to simply stop. To breathe. To exist without obligation. And it delivered. On paper. On the surface. In the photographs posted on the community's app every evening. By residents who wanted everyone to know exactly how good their life was now. But paradise has a way of hiding its rot. And the Villages had been hiding quite a lot of it. For quite a long time. Carol Ann Whitfield had moved here 3 years ago with her husband Richard. They had driven down from Columbus, Ohio. In a rented moving truck. With their furniture. And their photographs. In 26 years of shared history. She remembered looking at the community entrance for the first time. The stone archway. The flowers, planted in precise geometric patterns. The golf carts, moving quietly in both directions. She had felt something settle in her chest. Something like relief. Like finally. After all of it. They had made it somewhere good. She had been wrong about that. But she didn't know it yet. Carol Ann at 54 was a woman who had built her life around order and care. She had been a school librarian in Columbus for 22 years. She knew the Dewey Decimal System the way other people know their own address. She believed in the value of information. In the importance of accuracy. In the idea that if you paid close enough attention to the details, the full picture would eventually reveal itself. She was quiet in the way that certain intelligent people are quiet. Not shy. Observant. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered things. Names, dates, small details that other people let slide past them. Her students had loved her for it. Her colleagues had respected her for it. Richard had once found it charming. Every morning, she watered her garden at precisely 7 a.m. Not approximately. Precisely. She had a timer. Tomatoes, herbs, a row of marigolds along the fence that she had been growing from seed for 6 years. Every Friday, she brought homemade lemon cake to the community center. She had been doing it since their 3rd week in the Villages. She knew everyone's name. She remembered who took sugar and who didn't. She asked about grandchildren and doctor appointments and golf scores with genuine interest. Her neighbors loved her. She believed in routine because routine was honest. It said the same thing every day. It didn't change its story depending on who was asking. Richard had once been like that too. Or she had believed he was. Richard Whitfield at 57 was a man who had built his identity around competence and control. He had spent 30 years in banking, rising from a branch teller position in his early 20s to a senior management role at a regional bank in Columbus that he held for 15 years before early retirement. He was good at his job because he was disciplined. Numbers didn't lie if you ran them correctly. Processes didn't fail if you followed them precisely. He applied the same logic to everything. His golf clubs were organized by iron number in a custom case he had designed himself. He ironed his own shirts on Sunday nights. 7 shirts for 7 days. Pressed and hung in order. He maintained a spreadsheet for home maintenance tasks that dated back 11 years. People found Richard reliable. His colleagues trusted him with their finances. His friends asked his advice on investments. His neighbors borrowed his tools because they knew he kept them organized and clean and returned them the same way. He was the kind of man other men wanted to be, and other women thought their husbands should emulate. But Richard had a restlessness underneath all that order. A dissatisfaction that had grown quietly for years. Like mold behind drywall. Invisible. Odorless. Spreading. He had never spoken of it to Carol Ann. He had probably never spoken of it to anyone. He had simply carried it. And when they moved to the villages, that restlessness found an environment where it could finally breathe. Within 3 months of arriving, Richard had joined the golf league, the woodworking club, and a social group that met at the town square on Wednesday evenings. Carol Ann thought that was wonderful. She encouraged it. She was glad he was making connections, staying active, finding his people. Within 6 months, he had joined a 4th group. This one he didn't mention. It had no name on the community board. It didn't advertise. It didn't have a scheduled meeting time posted anywhere. It operated on personal invitation only. And it met on Thursday evenings at rotating homes throughout the community. Richard told Carol Ann he had joined a bowling league. He came home on Thursday nights, smelling like someone else's perfume, and with grass on his shoes when the lanes were indoors. She filed that away. She didn't say anything yet, but she filed it away. Diane Foster had been living in the villages for 5 years when Carol Ann arrived. Diane was 52. Blonde highlights that she refreshed every 6 weeks at the salon on Buena Vista Boulevard. A laugh that carried across a room and made people turn and smile without knowing why. Energy that never seemed to deplete. She was the woman who knew everyone and organized everything and showed up at every event with homemade sangria and a playlist. She was the one who sat with the new resident at the block party so they didn't feel alone. She was the connector, the warm center of every social circle she entered. She was the one who knocked on Carol Ann's door with a fruit basket on their 3rd day in the neighborhood. Mangoes and strawberries and a small bottle of Florida honey. She stayed for 2 hours. She knew the names of all the neighbors and the hours of every restaurant within golf cart range and the best time to use the pool to avoid the afternoon crowd. She told Carol Ann everything she needed to know about settling in. What she didn't tell her was that she was already friends with Richard, that they had met at a community mixer 6 weeks before Carol Ann arrived, when Richard had come down to set up the house, while Carol Ann wrapped up her final weeks at the school in Columbus. That in those 6 weeks, Diane had introduced Richard to the Thursday night group, that she had seen something in him at that mixer. A restlessness, a hunger for a life that felt different from the one he had built so carefully. Diane was very good at seeing that in people. She had befriended Carol Ann deliberately. Not out of malice exactly. Out of habit. Out of a philosophy she had developed over years in the villages. That said, the best way to keep things clean was to keep things close. Know the wife. Be her friend. Make yourself indispensable to her life. That way, there was no suspicion. No distance. No reason for anyone to look too closely. It was a calculation, dressed up as warmth. And Carol Ann, for a long time, had no reason to see it as anything else. Stephen Paul Colton lived 2 houses down from the Whitfields on Magnolia Crest Lane. 61 years old. Widower. retired contractor from Savannah, Georgia. He had a tan that came from genuine outdoor time, not a booth. He kept his lawn the best on the block. Edges sharp, not a weed visible. He drove a dark green golf cart that he kept cleaner than most people keep their cars. He had a slow, easy way of speaking, and a smile that arrived on his face, like a welcome mat being put out. Open, comfortable, inviting. He had lived in the Villages for 9 years. He knew more people in this community than anyone should realistically know. He attended every event, joined every club worth joining, and had a way of collecting information about the people around him, the way other retired men collected coins or vintage golf equipment. Quietly, persistently, without anyone quite noticing how much he had accumulated. Stephen's house was the original home of the Thursday night gatherings. It had the largest screened-in patio in the neighborhood, big enough for 20 people with room to spare. The best outdoor bar, a sound system that filled the space without bleeding into the street, and a back gate that opened onto a narrow landscaped path that connected to the rear properties of 4 neighboring homes. A path that was there in the original plans as a utility access route and had been quietly repurposed by Stephen into something more useful. Stephen believed in discretion, the way other men believed in religion. He had a set of rules he enforced without exception. No phones visible at gatherings. No photographs taken anywhere on the property. No discussion of attendees outside the group. No bringing someone new without a proper vetting process that Stephen handled personally. No exceptions to any of these rules, ever, for anyone. He told himself he was running something clean, a private arrangement between consenting adults in a community that had more loneliness and boredom in it than its promotional materials would ever admit. He provided a service. He facilitated connection. He asked for nothing in return, except discretion and a reasonable monthly contribution that covered operating costs. He had told himself this story for so long. It had become the only version of reality. He recognized. Carol Ann had waved at Stephen 100 times across the front lawn, had brought him lemon cake on 2 separate occasions, had chatted with him at the mailbox about weather and landscaping, and the quality of a new restaurant that opened on the main square. She had thought of him as a pleasant neighbor, quietly independent, minding his own business. She had never once felt afraid of him. That was a mistake she would think about later. Not with regret exactly. With the precise, clinical attention she applied to everything. Noting it. Learning from it. Understanding that the people most worth watching are the ones who make you feel there is nothing to see. The community of the Villages hummed along on its surface like a beautifully maintained machine. Golf carts at dawn and dusk. The distant sound of music from the town squares, floating across rooftops on warm evenings. Couples in matching visors, walking the paths around the lake. Grandchildren visiting on school breaks, and being photographed in front of the fountain, and sent home with citrus and stories about how wonderful the life was down here, beneath that surface, in the rotating Thursday night gatherings, in the carefully maintained silence around them, and the financial arrangements Stephen had constructed to support and protect them. Something very different was operating. A parallel community. Invisible. Self-sustaining. Growing. And like most things that grow in the dark, It had developed in ways that its creator had not fully intended and could no longer fully control. Carol Ann had no idea any of it existed until the Tuesday she found Richard's second email account. It was a small thing that started it. Richard had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he went to answer the front door. Carol Ann walked past it on her way to refill her coffee. The screen had gone to the browser's autofill page, and there were 2 Gmail accounts listed. One was Richard's regular account, the one she knew. The second had a username she had never seen before. She stood there for a moment, coffee cup in her hand, looking at that username. 8 characters. Random seeming. Not his name, or initials, or birthday, or anything she would have recognized. She didn't click on it. She walked to the window. She heard Richard talking to the neighbor at the front door. She heard him laugh at something. That easy, comfortable laugh. The one she had loved for 26 years. She stood at the window with her coffee, and she felt something shift very quietly inside her. Not panic. Not rage. Something colder and more deliberate than either. A door closing somewhere. A decision being made below the level of conscious thought. She went back to the counter, memorized the username, walked to the garden. That evening, she started the green notebook. She had bought it at the pharmacy 2 weeks earlier for grocery lists. It had a plain green cover and narrow-lined pages and a small elastic strap to keep it closed. It became something else that Tuesday evening when she sat at the kitchen table after Richard fell asleep and wrote the date at the top of the first page and began to write down everything she had noticed over the past several months that she had told herself meant nothing. The phone always face down. The new cologne she hadn't bought him, and he hadn't mentioned. The Thursday nights, and the grass on his shoes, and the smell she had filed away and not examined. Small things. Things that individually meant nothing, and together meant everything. She had spent 22 years as a school librarian. She understood that information has structure, that individual facts become meaningful when they are organized correctly, when you create a system for them, when you stop treating them as isolated and start treating them as connected. She created a system. For 8 months, Carol Ann maintained the green notebook with the same precision she had once applied to the library's cataloging system. Every Thursday, she noted the time Richard left and the time he returned. She began discreetly photographing vehicles she didn't recognize that appeared in the neighborhood on Thursday evenings. Using the camera on her phone from behind the living room curtain, she cross-referenced the plates she could read against the community's resident directory through the HOA's online portal, which she had access to as a registered homeowner. She noted names. She noted patterns. She noted the 4 texts she found one evening when Richard left his regular phone on the counter, and she saw Diane's name in the notification before the screen went dark. She noted the specific cologne. She researched it. $93 a bottle. She found the receipt 3 months later in a jacket pocket she was taking to the dry cleaner. She noted that too. She did not confront Richard. She did not call Diane. She did not speak to anyone about what she was doing. Not her sister in Ohio. Not a friend. No one. She understood. With the clarity of someone who had been trained to think carefully about information, that the moment she revealed what she knew, she would lose her ability to continue learning. Confrontation closes doors. Observation keeps them open. She needed to know everything before she moved. Not some things. Not most things. Everything. What she didn't understand yet was how deep the structure beneath the surface actually went. She understood the personal part within the first 2 months. Richard's involvement with the Thursday night group, the nature of the gatherings, the participants. She had collected enough by month 3 to have a clear picture of her husband's activities for the past 2 years. She knew about Diane. She suspected others. She had names and dates and enough photographic evidence of vehicles and late-night comings and goings to support what she knew. But it was the finances that she didn't understand yet. The discovery happened in month 5 of her documentation. She was reviewing the joint bank account statements, something she did monthly as part of her general household management. She had always done this. Richard knew she did this. He had apparently decided this meant she would never notice a new recurring charge because it was small and labeled generically $45 a month to a company called Suncoast Green Services Landscaping. She had assumed initially they had a landscaping service included in their HOA fees, but sometimes residents hired additional private services. She hadn't thought much of it. The first month, she saw it. The second month, she Googled the company name. No website. No business listing. No address. No reviews. Nothing. She noted it. In the green notebook. She circled it. She drew a line from it to Richard's name. Then she went back through 2 years of statements she had archived and found the charge appearing for 18 consecutive months. $45 every month. First of the month. Like clockwork. 45 times 18. $810 to a company that did not appear to exist. She found 4 other recurring charges from different accounts over the next 3 weeks. Small amounts. Different company names. Different frequencies. All sharing the same characteristic. No verifiable business presence. All connected through a pattern of payment timing she mapped out on a fresh page of the notebook to the Thursday evening schedule. She still didn't understand the full structure, but she understood that what Richard was involved in was not just personal. It had a financial dimension, and financial dimensions meant records, and records meant exposure. Stephen had been building the financial architecture of the Thursday night group for 7 years. What had started as a simple arrangement, a small fee from each participant to cover the costs of hosting and the private logistics of running a discreet gathering, had evolved into something considerably more complex. Over time, partly from practical necessity, and partly from Stephen's natural inclination towards systems and control, the fees had grown as the membership grew. What started as 10 or 12 regulars, had expanded to 41 active members across multiple streets and sections of the community. The money coming in each month was no longer pocket change. It was a real sum that needed to be handled carefully, placed somewhere that didn't attract attention, laundered, though Stephen never used that word, through a structure that made it look like something legitimate he had created. Suncoast Green Services. In year 2. A paper company. Registered in Florida. Through a registered agent service. No employees. No office. No equipment. No actual services rendered. Just a name on a document. And a bank account that received deposits and dispersed funds to other accounts according to a schedule Stephen maintained in his own head he had created for similar companies. Over the years, different names, different bank accounts, different registered agents. The money moved through them in rotation, mixing with small amounts of legitimate cash from a rental property Stephen genuinely owned in Ocala, which provided cover and plausibility to the overall flow. It was not the work of a professional money launderer, but it was careful, and it had been working for years, because nobody had thought to look at it until Carol Ann sat down with her bank statements and her green notebook and started drawing lines between things. The control element was the part that had grown beyond anything Stephen had originally planned. In the beginning, it had been simple. He kept mental notes about the members, who was there, what they did. The natural byproduct of running private gatherings was that you accumulated information. Information that was sensitive. Information that the people involved would not want shared. He had used it once, early on, when a member had decided to leave the group, and then made the mistake of mentioning to a mutual acquaintance that he knew about gatherings in the neighborhood. Stephen had paid him a visit. Quiet. Friendly. Just a reminder of what Stephen knew, and how easily some of it might find its way to the wrong ears. The man had said nothing further. After that, Stephen kept more formal records, not written down. He trusted his memory, and he trusted it completely. Dates, names, specific details, information organized and stored the way he stored everything, with precision, with purpose, with the understanding that information was not just knowledge, it was leverage, and leverage was security. Members who wanted to leave found the process more complicated than they had expected. A quiet conversation with Stephen, a gentle reminder, a suggestion that their involvement was perhaps deeper, on record, than they remembered. Nobody had ever gone to law enforcement. Nobody had ever gone public. The structure held, because Stephen knew the right amount of pressure to apply, and applied it with a smile and a slow Georgia drawl that made it feel almost like a friendly chat. Richard had known about the financial structure within his first 6 months in the group. Stephen had told him selectively, a little at a time, the way you tell someone things when you want them to feel trusted and implicated simultaneously. Richard was a banker. He understood what Stephen was doing. He had offered suggestions, small improvements, to the routing structure. Stephen had implemented 2 of them. That made Richard more than a participant. It made him a contributor. And contributors in Stephen's system were very difficult to walk away from. Richard had understood this. He had accepted it. He had told himself it was fine, because the amounts were small, and the exposure was minimal, and nobody was going to look at a handful of paper companies in Central Florida. He had told himself a version of this story. For 2 years, he had almost believed it. And then, Carol Ann had found the second email account, and somewhere in the back of his mind, beneath all the rationalizations and the carefully constructed calm, a very cold fear had begun to grow. Diane had known about the financial structure for approximately a year. Stephen had told her, not out of trust, but out of necessity. She handled some of the social logistics of the gatherings. She was the point of contact for female membership inquiries. She was, in practical terms, the front of house to Stephen's back office. She needed to know enough to do her job without asking questions that would slow things down. She had not been comfortable with what she learned, but she had been in too deep, personally and financially, by the time she fully understood it, to see a clean way out. She had told herself the same story Richard told himself. Small amounts, low profile, nobody's looking. She had also told herself that Carol Ann didn't need to know, that some things were better left in the dark, that she was actually protecting her friend by keeping her away from all of it. This was perhaps the most dishonest thing Diane had ever told herself, and she had told herself quite a few dishonest things over the years. Carol Ann chose a Thursday. Of course she did. She had been watching Thursdays for 8 months. She knew them intimately. She knew the rhythm of them. The way Richard's mood shifted slightly on Thursday afternoons, a restlessness that he masked with ordinary conversation and too careful normalcy. The way he always showered before leaving. The specific way he said, "I'll be back by midnight," with just enough casualness to signal that he had practiced it. She had planned for this particular Thursday for 2 weeks. She had made her decisions. She had written them down in the green notebook, not as plans exactly, but as a kind of reckoning. A list of what she knew. A list of what she needed to know. A list of what she intended to do when she knew enough. She had reached the bottom of the list. She let Richard leave. Watched from the kitchen window as his golf cart backed down the driveway, turned onto the street, and disappeared around the corner. 7:09 p.m. She noted the time. Then she put the notebook in her cardigan pocket and walked out the front door and 2 houses down. Stephen answered on her second knock. He was wearing a polo shirt and khaki shorts. A glass of something amber in his hand. He had the expression of a man who answers doors on Thursday evenings the way other men check their mailbox, routine, comfortable, expecting nothing complicated. The expression changed when he saw Carol Ann. She did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. She held up the green notebook and told him that she knew about Thursday nights. She knew about Diane. She knew about Suncoast Green Services and the 3 other paper companies she had identified. She knew about the membership fees. She knew about the leverage he kept on people who tried to leave. She knew most of it, she told him, and what she didn't know yet, she would find out, one way or another. It would be easier if he helped her. Stephen was quiet for a long moment. He took a slow sip of his drink. He looked at the notebook. He made a calculation. Carol Ann could see him making it. She had watched people make calculations her entire career. Students deciding whether to confess to plagiarism or hope they got away with it. Parents deciding whether to believe their child or the teacher. Richard deciding, every Thursday for 2 years, whether to tell her the truth or keep driving. She was very good at reading what the calculation produced. Stephen told her the name she asked for. She wrote it in the notebook. Thanked him. Turned around. Walked home. She heard his door close behind her. She did not look back. Back in the house, she made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the last page of the notebook for a few minutes. Then she went to the guest bedroom and locked the door and opened the voice recorder on her phone and pressed record and set it on the nightstand and did not turn it off. Richard came home at 11:43. She heard the golf cart. She heard the garage door. She heard his footsteps in the kitchen, slow and deliberate, the footsteps of a man who was trying to gauge something before he committed to a direction. A long pause. The sound of a cabinet opening and closing. Water running briefly. Then the footsteps came toward the kitchen table, where she was sitting. She had come back out of the guest bedroom and was sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook in front of her and her hands folded and her coffee cup to the side. She had made sure the kitchen light was on. She wanted him to see her clearly. She wanted there to be no ambiguity about what this moment was. Richard stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. Then he looked at the notebook. Something moved across his face. Not guilt. Not exactly. More like the particular expression of a man who has been running very fast for a very long time and has just understood that he has reached the edge of the surface he was running on. She told him what she knew. Methodically. Without anger. The same way she had told Detective Morrow a few hours later. Starting with the personal. Moving to the financial. Naming the companies. Naming the amounts. Naming Diane. Naming the name Stephen had given her. Not raising her voice, once. She told him she had already called a lawyer. This was true. She had called her sister's attorney in Columbus 3 weeks earlier for a referral, and had an initial consultation by phone the previous Friday. She told him she wanted him out of the house by morning. Richard stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You don't understand what you've started." His voice was different from usual. Quieter. The carefully maintained competence gone. Something rawer underneath it. She had never heard that voice from him before. She pushed her chair back slightly. She told him she understood perfectly. He looked at the notebook again. He looked like he wanted to say more. Instead he turned and walked toward the bedroom. She heard drawers opening, the closet, movement that was purposeful, but not rushed. The back door, a few minutes later. The golf cart starting, then quiet. She went back to the guest bedroom. Locked the door. She could see the recording on her phone was still running. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house. At 1:15 in the morning, her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it. It was a forwarded text. Her sister had set up a text monitoring mirror 6 months earlier, at Carol Ann's request. The original text had been sent to Diane from Richard's phone. It said, "She has the notebook. Everything." Carol Ann read it twice. Set the phone down. Sat still for a moment. Then she forwarded it to her lawyer's email with a brief note and timestamp and went back to sitting. Diane received that text and felt the floor drop out from under her. She sat up in bed, in the dark of her own house, 4 streets over, and held the phone and tried to think clearly. She was not a panicked person normally. She was a woman who had navigated complicated social situations her entire adult life, with a combination of warmth and calculation, and had never once let the calculation show through the warmth. But this was different. This wasn't social navigation. This was exposure. Real, documented, organized exposure, in the hands of a woman who happened to be a trained information professional who had spent 8 months doing nothing but collecting and organizing it. She texted Stephen. Stephen read the text and set his phone face down on his nightstand. He lay in the dark for several minutes. He ran through the options, methodically. He was a systematic thinker. He did not panic easily either. He thought about what Carol Ann had said to him at his door that evening. What she had showed him. How much of it was genuine documentation versus inference. He thought about the green notebook and what was likely to be in it and what wasn't. He picked up his phone. He typed one word, back to Diane. Handle it. Richard returned to the house at 2:30 in the morning. The back door was unlocked. The kitchen was dark. He walked through the house quietly, calling Carol Ann's name twice, in a low voice. He found the guest bedroom door locked. He stood outside it for 11 minutes. She could hear his breathing through the door. She sat on the bed, with the phone still recording, and did not speak, and did not move. He left again. Carol Ann did not sleep. At 6:47 in the morning, she walked out of the guest bedroom. She made coffee. She drank half a cup, standing at the kitchen counter. Then she called the Sumner County Sheriff's Office non-emergency line, and told the person who answered that she had information pertaining to financial crimes occurring within a private organization in the village's community. She gave her name and address, and said she would be available to speak with someone from the Financial Crimes Unit at any time that day. She hung up. She went out to the garden. 7 a.m. Like always. She watered everything carefully. The tomatoes, and the herbs, and the row of marigolds along the fence. She folded her gardening gloves and set them on the porch railing. She went inside to change her clothes. She brought lemon cake. She had made it the previous afternoon, because Friday was lemon cake day, and she had not been going to let what was happening to her marriage interfere with a 26-year baking habit. She brought it to the sheriff's station in a white container with a blue lid and set it on Detective Morrow's desk when he stood up to shake her hand. He looked at the cake. Then at her. She told him it was lemon. She told him it kept well and he should have a piece while it was fresh. Then she sat down and opened the green notebook to page 1. Detective Ray Morrow had a system for intake interviews. He let people talk. He didn't interrupt. He didn't guide. He had learned, over 11 years, that people reveal the most when you give them space and silence and let them fill it at their own pace. Some people rushed into the silence with emotion. Some people retreated from it with defensiveness. Some people broke down. Some people inflated. You learned a great deal about what you were dealing with just from watching how someone handled the quiet. Carol Ann Whitfield did not fill the silence at all. She presented information. She spoke in complete sentences. She referenced specific pages of the notebook as she spoke, turning it toward him so he could read along. She did not editorialize. She did not cry. She did not express anger at Richard or Diane or Stephen. She stated what she had observed, what she had documented, what she had inferred, and on what basis. When she was inferring rather than stating fact, she said so explicitly. When she had corroborating documentation, she produced it. By page 4 of the notebook, Detective Morrow had called in a colleague. By page 8, there were 3 detectives and a financial crimes investigator in the room. By noon, there were 6 people working off Carol Ann's documentation. She had brought the notebook, a USB drive, containing photographs and scanned documents, printed copies of 18 months of bank statements, with her annotations, in red pen, a printed copy of the Florida Business Registry entries for 3 of the 5 paper companies she had identified, and the audio recording from the previous night. The financial crimes investigator, a woman named Teresa Park, who had spent 8 years tracking money through shell structures before joining the county, listened to Carol Ann describe the payment routing system and then asked to hear it again. She asked 3 specific questions. Carol Ann answered all 3, without hesitation and with supporting documentation for each. Teresa Park looked at her supervisor, then back at Carol Ann, and said, "How long did you say you did this research?" 8 months. Carol Ann told her. Teresa Park was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That was better structured than most professional forensic accounting reports she received." Carol Ann thanked her and offered her the last piece of lemon cake. The investigation moved quickly once it had Carol Ann's framework to build on. Teresa Park and 2 colleagues worked through the paper company structure within 2 days and confirmed what Carol Ann had mapped. 5 companies. 18 months of documented inflow. A routing pattern that moved money through the companies in a cycle designed to obscure origin before it settled in Stephen's personal accounts in a property account in Ocala. The Ocala account led them to the rental property. The rental property was registered to a company. The company, when fully unwound, connected to a name that had not appeared in Carol Ann's notebook. A name nobody in the investigation had encountered yet. Patricia Ann Hollis. 63 years old. Retired federal employee. 13 years with the Department of Treasury. Resident of the Villages for 7 years. She lived on a street 2 sections over from Magnolia Crest Lane, in a house with a neatly tended front yard and a welcome mat that said, "Home is where the heart is." She drove a silver sedan. She volunteered at the community library on Monday afternoons. She had, as far as anyone in the investigation could initially determine, no connection to Stephen Paul Colton. Except through the company. Except through the Ocala rental property. Except through the routing pattern that, when Teresa Park traced it back far enough, showed Patricia's fingerprints on the structural design. The specific method of layering money through multiple entities with staggered timing and legitimate-seeming business purposes. That was not Stephen's work. Stephen was organized, but he was not a trained financial professional. The architecture of what he had built was more sophisticated than his background should have produced. Patricia's background explained it entirely. Diane was brought in for questioning at 2:15 that afternoon. She arrived looking composed. She had clearly spent the morning preparing herself. Professional clothes. Careful makeup. She had a lawyer with her, a man named Gerald, who wore a pale gray suit and spent most of the interview leaning toward Diane and saying things quietly before she answered questions. Diane answered in short, controlled sentences. She acknowledged knowing Stephen. She acknowledged having attended Thursday gatherings. She declined to characterize their nature. She declined to comment on any financial aspects. Then Detective Morrow played the audio recording from the previous night. Diane heard Richard's voice in the kitchen. She heard what he said. She heard Carol Ann's responses. She heard, in particular, a conversation that occurred in the kitchen at approximately 2:47 in the morning after Richard had returned, in which Richard made a reference to a specific account set up in Carol Ann's name that Carol Ann had not known about. An account that Richard had described in his own voice on that recording as a buffer. A place to put exposure if things came apart. Diane heard that and looked at Gerald, and Gerald looked at his hands. She confirmed the financial structure within 40 minutes. She provided Stephen's primary account numbers and the name of the registered agent he used for 2 of the companies, and the name of the accountant who had filed the tax documents for Suncoast Green Services for 2 of the 3 years it had existed. She did this in exchange for a cooperation agreement that the prosecutor's office was willing to offer, given the quality and specificity of what she provided. Gerald had, by that point, understood that his client was looking at serious charges if she didn't cooperate, and that the documentation, already in the investigation's hands, made a defense strategy very limited. Diane signed the cooperation agreement at 4:45 that afternoon. She did not look at Carol Ann on her way out. Carol Ann was not in the building by then. She had finished her interview hours earlier and gone home to water her garden. Richard was served that evening. 2 deputies came to the house, which Richard had returned to sometime during the morning, under the apparent assumption that Carol Ann had left, or that things could somehow still be managed. He was in the kitchen, making coffee, when they knocked. He accepted the divorce papers and the material witness notice without speaking. He sat down on the front porch step and read both documents twice. The sun was going down over the golf course behind the houses across the street. A neighbor went past on a cart and waved. Richard did not wave back. Stephen was not immediately arrested. The investigation needed time to build the full picture before a warrant could be sought. He continued his routine for 3 weeks while the financial crimes team worked. He went to his clubs. He attended events. He drove his clean green golf cart on the neighborhood paths and smiled at his neighbors, and did not know, or perhaps did not allow himself to fully believe, that the structure he had spent 7 years building was already being disassembled, file by file, in a county office building 20 minutes away. Patricia and Hollis, during those 3 weeks, was visited twice by investigators before the warrant was issued. She answered questions both times with the polite precision of a woman who had spent 13 years in federal service, knowing exactly where the legal lines were and how to stand just on the right side of them. She did not volunteer information. She did not lie. She simply answered only what was directly asked, with minimal elaboration, and let the silence do nothing for her questioners. The warrant for her arrest was executed 3 weeks and 2 days after Carol Ann's first visit to the station. 3 weeks and 4 days into the investigation, a document arrived on Detective Morrow's desk that stopped the room. It was a transaction record from the Suncoast Green Services account. Routine discovery in the financial review. Teresa Park had flagged it because it was anomalous within the account's pattern. Most transactions, in and out of the account, followed a predictable structure. Regular amounts. Regular timing. The kind of mechanical regularity that suggested automated transfers following a set schedule. This transaction was different. A single wire transfer. Larger than the membership fee deposits. Sent outward rather than inward. And the destination account was registered to Carol and Elizabeth Whitfield. The room went quiet. Detective Morrow read the record 3 times. Then he looked at Teresa Park. She had her hands flat on the table and was looking back at him with an expression that said she had read it the same number of times and reached the same place each time. He called Carol Ann. She arrived at 9 the following morning. She looked at the transaction record that he placed on the table in front of her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened the green notebook without any apparent hurry and turned it to a page she had marked with a red binder clip. She turned it toward Detective Morrow and Teresa Park. The entry on that page was dated 11 months earlier. Written in Carol Ann's even, careful handwriting. It described an evening when Richard had taken a phone call in the garage at approximately 11 p.m. She had been unable to sleep and had come downstairs for water. The garage door was closed, but not sealed, and she had stood in the kitchen and been able to hear fragments of the conversation through the interior door. She had heard her own name. She had heard the phrase, in her name. She had heard account and buffer and if it comes apart. She had written down every fragment she could recall. The date. The approximate time. The fact that she had not been able to hear the full conversation. The specific phrases she was confident she had heard accurately. And below that, in the same careful handwriting, a note that said she had contacted her bank on the date 14 days later to alert them to the possible unauthorized use of her identity for an account opening and to request that any account opened in her name without her presence be flagged and frozen pending her verification. Stapled to that page was a letter from the bank, dated 2 days after her contact, confirming that an account had been identified, that it had been frozen per her request, that the matter had been referred to their fraud unit and would be reported to the appropriate regulatory bodies per standard procedure. Richard had set up the account 10 months earlier. Carol Ann had frozen it 9 months and 2 weeks earlier. The single outward transfer in the Suncoast account records had been attempted 7 months earlier and had, according to the bank's subsequent documentation, been blocked. The money had never arrived. The account had been frozen before it could. Richard had built a trap using her name. She had locked the trap 8 days before he tried to use it. Detective Morrow sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Carol Ann. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her expression unchanged. Patient. Organized. Completely calm. He asked her when she had realized what Richard was doing. She said she had not known for certain. She had suspected, based on the fragments she had overheard, that an account might be created. She had not known it would be used as a financial buffer. She had reported it to the bank as a precaution, specifically because she did not know the full purpose. He asked her why she hadn't told the investigation about it earlier. She said she had been waiting to see if it became relevant. Teresa Park made a sound that was almost a laugh and then pressed her lips together and looked at her notes. The account structure, once it was fully understood, changed the charges available to the prosecutor's office substantially. Using another person's identity to establish a financial instrument intended to divert criminal proceeds and obscure the identity of the actual operators was not a minor addition to the existing fraud and money laundering charges. It was a significant escalation. It transformed Richard from a peripheral participant and material witness into a principal in the financial scheme. Diane had known about the account plan. This came out in her second interview after she had been shown the transaction record and Carol Ann's bank letter. She had known for approximately 6 months. She had told herself Richard wouldn't go through with it. That it was the kind of thing men said when they were afraid and needed to feel like they had a contingency. She had not reported it. She had not warned Carol Ann. She had filed it in the same place she filed all the things that were uncomfortable to hold and let it sit there in the dark. Stephen, when confronted with the account structure, took 4 minutes to respond. He spent those 4 minutes looking at the transaction record on the table. When he finally looked up, his expression was not the easy smile and the slow drawl. It was something more fundamental. Something that had been underneath the charm the entire time. He asked for his attorney and said nothing further that day. And then, the second twist. Buried in the financial records that Teresa Park's team had been working through since week 1 was a pattern that had initially appeared to be noise. Small amounts. Irregular timing. Moving through a different route from the main membership fee structure. Not connected to any of the 5 paper companies. Going to an account associated with the Ocala vacation rental. The rental property was the legitimate component of Stephen's financial picture. It generated real income. It had real tenants. It was filed properly and taxed properly and was the one piece of his financial life that was exactly what it appeared to be. Or so they had assumed. When Teresa Park's colleague followed the rental's associated account backward through its full history, she found a secondary layer. A second account attached to the same property. One that received deposits from a source that was not rental income. deposits that had been flowing in for 6 years. That predated the membership fee structure. That had been there, in fact, before Stephen started the Thursday night gatherings in their current form. That account connected to Patricia, not as a silent beneficiary, as the architect, as the person who had designed the entire financial infrastructure before Stephen implemented it, as the person who had been, for 6 years, not just receiving a share of the proceeds, but actively managing the structure from behind the visible layer of names and companies. Patricia and Hollis had spent 13 years at the Department of Treasury. She had spent the last 7 years in the Villages, appearing to be a quiet retired woman who volunteered at the library on Mondays. And in between, she had designed and maintained a financial concealment system for a private criminal enterprise operating inside a retirement community in Central Florida. She was arrested at 8:42 in the morning on a Tuesday at the Publix on Powell Road. A plainclothes deputy approached her in the refrigerated section as she was reaching for orange juice. She put the orange juice back on the shelf. She straightened her cardigan. She asked if she could finish her shopping first. The deputy said no. She nodded. She did not say anything else. She walked out of the store between 2 deputies without any visible emotion and did not speak again without her attorney present. The Villages community watched it happen from golf carts and mailboxes and front windows. By noon, it was on the neighborhood app. By evening, it had been picked up by local news. By the following morning, it had national interest. The Thursday Night Club's membership list was included in the court filing for the warrant. 41 names. 9 streets. People whose golf carts you passed every day. People whose lawns you admired. People who organized charity drives and sat on HOA committees and waved at you in the town square on Friday evenings. The community did not recover quickly from seeing that list. The Sumner County Courthouse had been built for the quiet work of a mid-sized county. Deed transfers and traffic hearings and occasional felony cases that got 3 paragraphs in the regional paper and were forgotten by the following week. It had a functional lobby and 4 courtrooms and parking for approximately 80 vehicles. The parking situation became a problem the week the Villages case began. Vehicles arrived from Orlando and Tampa and Jacksonville. News vans from 2 networks. True crime podcasters who had been following the story since the arrest of Patricia Hollis had set up near the entrance. A woman selling handmade t-shirts that read, "The Villages, where everything is green including the money," had been asked to move twice by the time the first day of proceedings began. The public gallery for Stephen Paul Colton's trial was full every day. Retired residents in sun visors and pastel shirts occupied most of the seats, watching with the focused attention of people who had followed this story from its beginning and felt, in some way, that they wouldn't have been fully able to articulate that they were owed this ending. People whose neighbors were on that list. People who had attended events organized by Diane and smiled at Stephen across the backyard fence and trusted the surface of things without ever thinking to look below it. Stephen's defense team was good. They argued thoughtfully and professionally that the Thursday night gatherings were a matter of personal freedom between consenting adults and that whatever activities occurred within them were not the business of the state. They were right about that, technically. The prosecution agreed that the personal dimension of the gatherings was not at issue in this courtroom. The financial crimes were the issue. The blackmail and coercion of members who wished to exit were the issue. The money laundering operation that had been running for 7 years using fictitious companies and an elaborate routing system designed to obscure origin was the issue. The defense argued that Stephen had been providing an organizational service and that what members did voluntarily with their own money was not coercion, simply because Stephen maintained records. The prosecution introduced testimony from 3 former members who had tried to leave the group and described in detail the specific conversations Stephen had initiated with each of them. The specific information he had referenced. The specific quiet certainty with which he had explained why leaving was complicated. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 7 of 9 counts. Guilty. Financial fraud. Money laundering. Blackmail. Conspiracy. The 3 counts they rejected were peripheral charges that the prosecution had included, understanding they might not hold. The core was intact. Stephen stood to receive the verdict in the same suit he had worn every day of the trial. Charcoal gray. Well fitted. He had been well presented throughout. Composed. The easy smile had not reappeared since the day Carol Ann stood at his door. In its place was a kind of enforced stillness. The expression of a man containing something very tightly. He thanked his attorneys after the foreman finished reading. He was let out without incident. 12 to 15 years. Minimum security, federal facility. He would be in his mid-70s when he was released, if released, at the minimum. The man who had spent 9 years as the center of a community within a community, who had known everyone's secrets and moved money through paper ghosts and controlled a small ecosystem of people through carefully applied pressure, would live those years in a facility in Central Florida within driving distance of the life he had built and lost. Patricia Ann Hollis did not go to trial. Her attorney approached the prosecutor's office 2 weeks before her scheduled trial date with a cooperation offer. Full acknowledgement of her role in the financial architecture. Complete documentation of the system she had designed. Testimony against Stephen in exchange for a recommended sentence reduction. The prosecutor accepted. The information Patricia provided was detailed and technically precise, in a way that made Teresa Park say, privately, that it was the clearest explanation of a layering structure she had ever received. Patricia received 7 years. Federal facility. She appeared for her sentencing in a cream-colored blouse and dark slacks, and read a prepared statement in which she said she had spent years convincing herself that her expertise, applied to something outside legitimate channels, was victimless, because no individual person was directly harmed by the money movement. She said she understood now that this was a failure of moral reasoning, and that she accepted the court's judgment. The judge told her that the construction of sophisticated concealment systems for criminal enterprises was not a victimless act, regardless of what the money was funding. That the infrastructure of crime causes harm by enabling it to persist and expand. That her professional background made her more responsible for knowing this, not less. Patricia sat down. She did not look at Stephen. Diane stood in front of the court on a Tuesday afternoon, looking considerably diminished from the woman who had shown up to her first interview in full professional presentation. 3 years in the villages had not entirely prepared her for what the following year had been. She had lost weight. The bright loud laugh that filled rooms was gone. She stood quietly and heard the judge describe her conduct and her choices and her failure to protect a person she had claimed as a friend. She received 3 years probation. No incarceration. The cooperation agreement had held. Her attorney stood beside her and looked professionally satisfied. Diane herself looked like someone who has been told they have avoided a fall and cannot quite feel relieved because they can still see the edge. She left the villages 8 months later. Her house was on the market for 11 days. She told no one she was going. She packed herself over 2 days and drove away on a Wednesday morning with 2 suitcases in the back seat of her car. No golf cart. She had sold it. She did not go down the block she had organized and barbecued and walked and coffeed and built an entire architecture of false warmth on. She took the back way to the main road and did not look in the rearview mirror once. Not a door on the block opened. Not a golf cart stopped. After 5 years of being the connector, the organizer, the warm center of everything, the morning she left was the quietest her street had been in years. Richard Whitfield's trial took 3 days. He had a good attorney who worked hard with what was available, which was not much. The audio recording from the night Carol Ann sat in the guest bedroom and recorded everything was admissible, and the jury heard Richard's voice saying what he said. Clear. Unmistakable. His own voice, describing the account in her name and what it was for. Carol Ann testified for 3 hours on the second day. She sat in the witness chair, the way she sat everywhere, straight, still, precise. She answered questions directly. She referenced dates. She did not editorialize. The defense attempted twice to suggest that her 8 months of documentation represented participation rather than observation, that a person who watches a crime for 8 months before reporting it might reasonably be considered complicit in its continuation. Both times, the prosecution objected. Both times, the judge sustained. The defense moved on. Carol Ann never raised her voice. She never addressed Richard directly. She looked at the jury when she answered, and at the attorneys when she needed to, and when she stepped down from the stand, she walked the length of the room without looking at the table where Richard sat, in his iron shirt, with his golf club posture, in his hands, that had always been so steady and certain. He watched her cross the room and go through the door. He kept watching the door after it closed. His attorney said something to him quietly. He did not appear to hear it. Guilty. Financial fraud. Conspiracy. Obstruction of justice, for the account in Carol Ann's name. 8 years. Minimum security. He would be 65 when he was eligible for release. The structured, organized, disciplined life he had built over 3 decades would wait for him, reduced and reshuffled, on the other side of those years. Carol Ann was not in the courthouse on sentencing day. She was home. 7 a.m. Her garden was doing well. The marigolds had come back strongly this year, and the tomatoes were ahead of schedule, and she had added a row of basil along the south edge of the bed that was coming up beautifully. She watered everything with the careful attention she gave to everything. Then she folded her gloves on the porch railing and went inside. Her neighbor across the street saw her from his kitchen window. He said later that she looked like a woman who had set something down that she had been carrying for a very long time. He said she looked lighter. He said she looked like herself, though he couldn't have said exactly what he meant by that, except that whatever he had been seeing on her face for 3 years, whatever careful composed mask a person wears when they are surviving something, was gone. The house on Magnolia Crest Lane sold in late autumn. A couple from Michigan bought it. Retired teachers, both of them. They had read about the villages in a retirement magazine and done their research and decided, as many people do, that the surface was what they were buying, and the surface looked very good. They moved in with plants and photographs and a welcome mat that said peace and love, and repainted the front door a soft sage green that Carol Ann would have liked. Carol Ann had moved back to Ohio in September. Not Columbus. A smaller town 2 hours north. A place with a library that needed volunteers, and a community garden that needed tending, and streets where people walked in the evenings and said hello to each other and meant nothing complicated by it. She took the green notebook. She did not take it as a record of what had happened to her marriage, or as documentation of the investigation, or as evidence of anything. She took it because it was hers. Because she had made it. Because 8 months of careful attention and organized thinking had produced it, and those were not qualities she wanted to leave behind, in a house, on a street, she was done with. She kept it in the drawer of her nightstand, in the new house, and sometimes, in the evenings, She opened it, not to read it, but just to hold it, for a moment, and remember what she was capable of, when she paid attention to the right things. She started volunteering at the library the week she arrived. 3 mornings a week. Cataloging and shelving and helping the after-school reading group on Thursdays. Not because she needed to fill time. Because she had been a librarian for 22 years, and it was the truest thing she knew how to be, and she had missed it more than she had admitted to herself during the retirement years in Florida. The children in the reading group liked her immediately. She had that quality that good librarians have. She listened to what they said as if it mattered, because to her, it did. She remembered their names and their preferences and what book each of them had been reading last week. She brought lemon cake on Fridays. The villages continued. That was the thing about communities built on the premise of perfection. They continued. The HOA restructured its board. 3 members, who had been on the list, resigned and were replaced through a special election that had a higher turnout than any previous HOA election in the community's history. Vendor contracts were audited. 2 were terminated. New procurement policies were written and approved. The community's management company issued a letter to all residents describing the changes and assuring them that the integrity of the community remained intact. The 41 names on the court record lived a variety of lives after the trial. Some moved away quickly. Some stayed and weathered the social aftermath, which was considerable, for several months, and then faded in the way that communal attention always fades when it moves on to the next thing. Some couples, who had been on the list, separated afterward. Some stayed together. The personal consequences of what the Thursday night club had facilitated were distributed unevenly across 41 households in ways that the court record did not capture and the community news did not fully report. The back gate at Stephen's old property was sealed by the new owners within a week of moving in. They had no idea what it had been used for. They just didn't like the idea of a gate opening onto other people's properties. They planted a hedge. Detective Ray Morrow kept the lemon cake container on the corner of his desk for 2 years. It was the white container with the blue lid that Carol Ann had set on his desk the morning she came in. He had meant to throw it away a dozen times. He kept not doing it. He couldn't have said exactly why. It was not a sentimental man's reason. He was not a particularly sentimental man. But there was something about that container that functioned for him as a kind of reminder. About preparation. About the difference between reacting to things and understanding them. About what it looks like when someone pays close enough attention for long enough that when they finally act, the outcome is already decided. A new detective joined his team 2 years later and asked about the container during her first week. He told her the story. She listened without interrupting, which he noted. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, she brought cake to the police station while turning in her own husband? He said yes. Lemon, she asked. He said yes. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, that seemed right somehow, and he agreed that it did. The story of Carol Ann Whitfield circulated in the villages for years after she left. Not as a crime story, exactly. As something more complicated than that. A story about what happens when you underestimate the person standing quietly at the kitchen window. When you mistake patience for ignorance. When you build your security on the assumption that the person who sees the most will say the least. She had said nothing for 8 months. And then she had said everything. And she had said it once, clearly, with full documentation, in the calm even voice of a woman who had organized information for 22 years and understood that the difference between a fact and a truth was simply the number of facts you had assembled around it. Some betrayals arrive loudly. Raised voices and slammed doors, and the kind of confrontations that neighbors hear through walls and remember for years. They have a dramatic quality that makes them feel like endings. Like the thing has been broken and can now be examined in pieces. Some betrayals are different. They are built slowly, over years, in the spaces between ordinary things. In golf carts, on Thursday evenings. In text messages, sent after midnight. In paper companies that don't exist, in accounts opened in someone else's name, in a best friend's warm smile, calculated to a purpose she never stated. They are built so carefully that the person they are built against doesn't feel them as betrayal while they are happening. They feel them as small wrongnesses that don't quite add up yet. Until they do. Carol Ann had felt those small wrongnesses for months before she began writing them down. She had felt them and trusted them and said nothing and watched and waited and written everything down with the careful attention of a woman who understood that the difference between knowing and being able to prove is simply organization. She had proved everything. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. Out of the same quality that had made her a good librarian for 22 years. The belief that accurate information, carefully organized, tells the truth about the thing it describes. Always. Without exception. You only have to be patient enough to gather enough of it. The villages called it self-paradise. The brochures said it. The entrance archway said it. The smiling faces in the photographs said it. And in many ways, it was. The pools were clean. The golf courses were well maintained. The music in the town squares played every single evening. People who moved there with honest intentions found exactly what they had been looking for. But paradise is not an absence of darkness. It is a location. And darkness travels. It follows people into their best decorated rooms, in their most comfortable chairs, and their most carefully constructed new starts. It does not respect the planned community entrance. It does not respond to HOA guidelines. What it does respond to is attention. To a woman who wakes up every morning at 7 a.m. and tends what she has planted and pays attention to what is actually there rather than what she has been told is there. Who writes things down? Who knows the difference between a rumor and a fact? Who understands that information organized correctly is the most powerful thing a careful person can hold? Carol Ann Whitfield drove north in September with her furniture and her photographs and the green notebook in 26 years of understanding what betrayal looks like when it is dressed in ordinary clothes. She drove past the stone archway and the geometric flower beds and the golf carts moving quietly in both directions, and she did not look back at any of it. She had watered her garden that morning. 7 a.m. Like always. Some things you take with you when you leave. Not as weight. As evidence of who you are. She drove north with hers. If you want more shocking true crime stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment below. Because the darkest secrets are always hiding in the most perfect looking places. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who has been paying the most attention.